Since 2020, we've all become too familiar with what living through a pandemic looks like. We learned about flattening the curve, quarantine measures, and superspreader events. For today's video, I challenged myself to bring the underlying mathematical patterns of infectious disease transmission to life, setting out with the goal to visualize factors like population density, reinfection rates, and hospital capacity. That's why I built a dynamic particle simulation in R, heavily inspired by a video from 3Blue 1Brown, who's created something very similar using a custom Python library called Manon. By applying a standard SIR model, I'm going to run through 14 parameters to illustrate how changing things like infection probability, movement speed, or recovery time impacts the outbreak and trajectory of viral diseases. We'll also explore what happens if you combine two or more input variables. For example, what happens if we enforce virus containment policies but miss asymptomatic patients that don't show any symptoms but still have a chance of infecting others. Before we dive into our simulation, let me outline our basic setup. To describe infectious diseases, epidemiologists like to use what's called an SIR model. This model separates a population into one of three categories: those who are susceptible to contracting the disease, those who are currently infected with the disease, and those who have recovered from the disease. Some versions of the SIR model use the more generic term removed instead of recovered to illustrate that those patients have become immune and can no longer get the disease. We're going to relax this assumption later when we introduce reinfection, but I'm going to keep it simple for our base case. Each simulation begins with at least one infection, which you can think of as our patient 0. We give this patient an infection radius, and at every time step, there's a certain probability they'll infect someone nearby who's still susceptible. This physical proximity acts as a stand-in for disease transmission factors like touching, kissing, or sneezing. Then, for each infected individual, we define a recovery time, after which they won't be able to spread the disease anymore. We start off with a simple base case scenario and then slowly add complexity, changing one variable at a time. In this base case, we're assuming a population of 100 people taking a casual stroll around town. Their movement is simulated as a random walk, represented by the dots bouncing around within the square, change in direction whenever they hit an edge. Susceptible individuals have a 25% chance of getting infected and recover after 30 time steps. I've written time as a fixed interval for each simulation, so since I've rendered my video output as 30 frames per second with 300 steps, each simulation is 10 seconds long. You'll also notice that we're counting the number of currently infected individuals alongside the live R number. The R number tells us, on average, how many people one infected person will pass the disease to. If R is above 1, the infection spreads. If it's below 1, it will die out. In our SIR model, R naturally decreases over time as more people recover and become immune. Now that we understand our basic setup and model assumptions, let's start by changing the population density. For example, what do you expect would happen if we cut our population density in half? As you can see, the number of infections doesn't rise nearly as fast, as infected individuals don't get in contact with other susceptible individuals as often. What if we double our population to 200? Unsurprisingly, the number of infected individuals jumps up, and our R number spikes as high as 5, leaving only 14% of individuals susceptible at the end of our simulation run. And here you see what I like to call the central line experience of the London Underground during rush hour, where we've increased our base case population by a factor of 5. We can see this initial outburst where most people get infected right from the start, then recover eventually, and only leave a few scattered susceptible individuals behind at the end of our simulation run. Here's the same variations side by side so you can see how they compare next to our base case. Next, let's play around with the infection radius. What do you think might happen if we increase or decrease the radius within which the disease gets transmitted to susceptible individuals? If you decrease the radius from 0.5 to 0.2, for example, we can see that the virus basically doesn't get a chance to spread at all, as infected individuals don't get in contact with susceptible ones. On the other hand, as we increase the radius to 0.7, our infection curve rises much more rapidly before individuals eventually recover. Now, if we increase the infection radius even further to 0.12, we can see a sudden explosion of red as our entire population gets infected almost immediately. Again, putting the four scenarios next to one another, we get a better feeling for how the infection radius impacts outcomes in our SIR model. Without me showing you any scenarios, you probably already have an intuitive understanding of how our model would behave to changes in the infection probability. If we cut down the chance of getting infected to 10% instead of 25%, we observe a more gradual incline of infections. If we increase the chance, however, let's say to about 70%, we can see something not quite as intuitive. When the infection probability is very high like this, we see a sharp early spike in cases, but the epidemic actually infects fewer people overall. With a lower infection probability, the spread is slower, allowing more people to eventually get infected and recover. In other words, if the epidemic moves so fast, it can run out of susceptible cases before everyone is reached. This is an interesting dynamic, which we can see in action when comparing four different infection probabilities side by side, while keeping all other assumptions the same. Contributing to the fact that the disease spread can run out of susceptible individuals is our recovery time assumption, which dictates how long it takes for our little simulated dots to develop immunity. Before I show you the results, how do you think a longer recovery time will impact the distribution of patients over time in the SIR states compared to our base case model? You've guessed correctly if you expected the time lag between our infection and recovered curve to get bigger, giving infected individuals more time to spread the disease. In contrast, a faster recovery rate lets the infected and recovered curve trace much closer to each other, as patients don't take as long to get back on their feet. Again, this pattern becomes best visible if we look at four scenarios with various recovery rate settings and compare them against one another. We've already simulated population density by varying the number of people in our square, thereby indirectly impacting their contact frequency, as we kept the physical size of the square the same. However, another more direct way of modeling the contact frequency is by changing the movement speed parameter. For example, we might lower the movement speed parameter to model less social mixing, effectively reducing the mobility of our population. As people reduce their contacts, we can see that the disease can't get a foothold, as susceptible individuals don't enter the infection radius of contagious individuals fast enough. If we dial up the speed parameter in our simulation, we see our dots starting to behave like popcorn kernels bouncing around in a hot pan. The faster they move, the more they crash into each other. Looking at four different movement speed scenarios at the same time, we can begin to understand how the frequency of contact and disease spread intercorrelate. So far, all our simulations started with one infected individual, but now it's time to change that. If you're a 90s kid like me who's played Stronghold Crusader growing up, chances are you have experimented with the tactic to throw dead cow cadavers into the enemy camp via catapults to create a disease outbreak, weakening the enemy forces. This is basically what we see if we set our initial number of infected to 30, so almost 1/3 of our entire population. As expected, we see a rapid spike in infections, which would have been equivalent to the demise of our enemies in the game. We can see this effect even with much lower numbers. As you can see, increasing the initial number of infected from 1 to 3 is enough to create a big jump in infections. Seeing multiple scenarios side by side, it's easy to visualize how a larger initial outbreak can ignite the spread much more rapidly. To make our SIR model a bit more realistic, let's make the assumption that with a certain probability, individuals will visit a central location, like a train station, a grocery store, or a local pharmacy. After all, people don't spend all their day having a mooch around town. As you can see, people visit that central location, marked with the dotted blue lines, regularly with a probability we can define. This central location soon becomes a virus transmission zone, as the physical limitation of the space, combined with the pooling of individuals all in one spot, creates the perfect breeding ground for the disease to spread. I ran this scenario with 4 different visit probabilities per time step, setting the chance for an individual to visit the central location to 0.5, 1, 2, and 3%. Unsurprisingly, the higher the probability for a visit, the higher the initial infection spike before people reach immunity. Like so many of us, I had to isolate a few times during the pandemic. The idea is simple. If we could move all infected people into one quarantine zone, marked by the red dotted line here, we should be able to control the spread, right? And yes, in a perfect world where we have little to no delay in identifying infected cases, an isolation strategy can be very effective. However, in the real world, that detection delay is usually much longer, causing infected individuals to run around for a while before eventually isolating themselves. On top of that, most humans are social creatures and hence don't like to be locked up in a cage, causing them to escape the quarantine zones with a certain chance. I've tried capturing this by building in a leakiness parameter, allowing patients to break free while they're still infected. Now, those more realistic factors all make it so that the spread cannot be contained as fast in our ideal scenario, but the theory still holds that isolating infected cases helps with disease control. I'll let you decide what patterns you notice across these 4 simulations, each with different settings for detection delay and how leaky the quarantine is. What we haven't accounted for until now is that infectious diseases can be very sneaky. Just because a patient gets infected, it doesn't necessarily mean that they develop symptoms. Yet they still carry the virus, contributing towards the disease spread. We call such patients asymptomatic, and in our model we visualize them using purple dots and infection circles. We can play around with the proportion of asymptomatic patients in our model, which sets the bar for how hard it will be to control the disease spread. As a rule of thumb, the more asymptomatic patients there are, the more challenging it will be to contain the disease from spreading, as asymptomatic patients don't change their behavior due to the lack of symptoms. This really becomes visible when we look at a combined scenario with asymptomatic patients and quarantine isolation, as we're not able to detect cases in which patients don't show any symptoms. Hence, the disease has better chances of lingering around for longer. When rules aren't followed, like we saw with certain gatherings at Downing Street, infections can spread incredibly fast. So let's look at how high-contact superspreader events can actually ignite an outbreak in our simulation. I've shown these events as yellow squares that pull people in. Each person has a certain probability of joining the event. Now, what's interesting here is that the first superspreader event triggers a massive spike in infections. But the second one? It doesn't make a dent, because by that point, everyone who was infected has already recovered. We can adjust things like how often these events happen, how long they last, and how many people they attract. And when we do, you can really see how these events drive those sharp spikes in infections. There's one big factor we haven't considered yet. Some infected patients won't recover, they'll die instead. How many die thereby depends on how lethal the disease is. We can simulate this lethality by varying the mortality rate. So I ran the model with the mortality rate set at 15, 30, 50, and 80%. You can see how dramatically it changes the proportion of patients in each state in our extended SIR model. Here's something odd. The most lethal diseases aren't always the ones that cause the most deaths overall. Why is that? Because if patients die too quickly before they can infect other hosts, the disease simply doesn't spread widely enough. So a disease that's 100% lethal and kills quickly might actually cause fewer total deaths than a disease with 30% mortality that takes longer to run its course, giving people more time to spread it to others. Another crucial real-world factor we're missing is reinfection. Viruses adapt and mutate, changing how they behave in the body. That means you can't always build immunity, even if you've been infected before. To add reinfection to our model, we need 2 parameters. First, how susceptible are recovered patients to getting reinfected? And second, how much time passes between the initial infection and reinfection? Let's look at an extreme scenario to see this clearly. If we set the reinfection delay to 0, the proportion of infected individuals shoots up quickly and, unlike our base case without reinfection, stays consistently high over time. When we assume some level of reinfection, the model essentially creates a tug-of-war between recovered patients and currently infected ones. This continues until the last infected individual finally recovers. I was debating whether or not to show the results for the next scenario, since I don't believe they're entirely accurate. But I thought it would still be valuable to demonstrate how these models have limitations and don't always reflect reality perfectly. What you're seeing on screen is a scenario where I tried to simulate social distancing. At a defined point in time, all individuals in the model return to their homes, represented by those small blue squares. However, when we compare the scenario side by side with one without the intervention, something strange happens. We'd expect that having everyone return home, reducing their contact with others, would lead to lower overall mortality. Yet, that's not what the model predicts. It appears that the way the model handles the movement of people back into their homes introduces a sudden spike in infections right when the intervention begins. I wanted to show this as a bit of a cautionary tale. If you ever build a SIR model yourself, make sure to run a quick sense check. Ask whether the results make intuitive, real-world sense before drawing conclusions. One reason we've heard so much about flattening the curve is that hospitals can get overwhelmed when too many patients become sick at once. Once they hit capacity, hospital mortality rises sharply. Let's say our hospital can serve 10% of our simulated population of 100 people, so it has 10 beds. When those beds fill up, any additional patients face an overflow mortality rate that's much higher than the usual disease mortality. You can think of this as doctors and nurses working exhausting hours, patients getting less attention, and even emergencies like heart attacks or strokes facing delays. In our simulation with 100 people, we don't hit capacity. Everything runs smoothly. But if we increase the population to 150, beds fill up faster and that overflow mortality rate kicks in, causing more deaths overall. In a perfect world, we could just expand hospital capacity. For example, if we double the number of beds from 10 to 20, the system can handle more patients. That keeps the overflow mortality from triggering, and while some patients still die, total mortality stays much lower than when capacity is limited. You could come up with plenty more scenarios like these, especially once you start combining different parameters. The R code I used for this simulation has all the key inputs right at the top, and it's freely available through the link in the video description. That way you can easily tweak the model parameters and turn different scenarios on or off by setting them to true. Now, there are a lot of possible combinations, so I haven't been able to test every single one. In theory, they should all work interdependently, but if you spot any errors or have any ideas for improvements, I'd really appreciate your feedback. And just for full transparency, all of this was vibe coded with the help of Claude Code, which saved me from spending weeks writing close to 1,500 lines of R code from scratch. If coding in R is not your thing and you prefer more traditional software like Excel, then go check out one of my other videos where I built a patient-level simulation model in Excel without using any VBA.